Nestled deep within a vast forest, the village of Adumu stood as a testament to the harmony between the natural world and the unseen forces that governed it. Surrounded by towering trees that whispered secrets only the elders seemed to understand, the village was a place where old beliefs thrived. The villagers, with their hands calloused from years of labor and their hearts intertwined with the land, lived in unspoken reverence of the spirits and gods who walked beside them. Every evening as the sun dipped below the horizon, the village elders gathered by the firelight to share stories of the ancestors, of gods who once walked the earth, and of spirits that danced in the winds. The lines between the living and the dead were blurred here, with every tree, every stone, and every gust of wind believed to carry a message from the past. It was a place where the supernatural was not feared but woven into the fabric of daily life. In this village there lived a woman named Zuri. She was a picture of grace and strength, beloved by everyone who knew her. With her deep, compassionate eyes and her warm smile, she exuded a kindness that seemed to shine brighter than the sun itself. Zuri was the kind of woman who could calm the storm with just a word and who brought peace wherever she walked. Her love for her husband, Kofi, was well known across the village. Together they were a perfect match, two souls bound together by love, their bond unwavering through the years. Kofi, a strong and gentle man, stood by her through every hardship, his love for her as constant as the rising of the moon. But despite the depth of their love and the strength of their union, there was one thing Zuri and Kofi longed for more than anything else: children. For many years they tried, prayed, and hoped for the blessing of a child to fill their home. But the years passed, and with each passing moon, their hope turned into quiet sorrow. Zuri's womb remained empty, and the village would often see the quiet sorrow in her eyes when she passed by the children who played in the fields, their laughter filling the air. For all their prayers, for all their longing, no child came. Zuri's struggle with infertility did not go unnoticed by the villagers. The once quiet whispers grew louder, until the sorrow in her heart became a legend of sorts, a story passed down in hushed tones as the years went by. To the people of Adumu, it seemed as though the spirits had abandoned her. And in the depths of the village, there was one who could see what others could not. The village healer, a woman of deep knowledge, feared and respected for her wisdom in both the physical and spiritual realms. It was the healer, old and bent with age, who first saw the truth behind Zuri's barren womb. One day, as Zuri stood before her, desperate and tearful, seeking answers, the healer looked at her with solemn eyes. The words the healer spoke would change Zuri's life forever. "You will never bear children," she said, her voice heavy with the weight of her prophecy. "The spirits have cursed your bloodline for a debt owed long ago. Your family has wronged the spirits, and this is the price you must pay." The words struck Zuri like a bolt of lightning. It was a curse, a punishment for something her ancestors had done, something she could not understand or change. The healer spoke of an ancient wrong, an ancestral debt that had been forgotten by time but never forgiven. Zuri's family had broken a pact with the spirits long before she was born, and now the price was being paid. The healer warned her that no matter how much she prayed, no matter how many offerings she made to the gods, the curse could not be lifted. Zuri would never know the joy of motherhood. The grief she had carried for so long was now confirmed by the very person she had turned to for answers. But despite the healer's grim words, despite the heavy weight of the curse that hung over her, Zuri did not let her heart grow cold. Kofi stood by her side, his love unwavering, his faith in her unbroken. Together they refused to give up on their dream. In the face of this harsh prophecy, Zuri's spirit did not break. The village might have believed her future to be sealed, but Zuri and Kofi knew there was more at work than just curses and prophecies. There was still hope, still the possibility of change. And so, they continued their search not just for a child but for redemption, for the chance to right the wrongs of the past and restore balance to their lives. Every night, Zuri would pray not just for a child, but for a way to lift the curse that held her family in its grip. She prayed for her ancestors, for the spirits who watched over them, and for the gods who had been offended. Zuri's prayers were not of desperation but of deep yearning, a plea for forgiveness, for peace, and for the possibility that the future could still hold something beautiful. Kofi too prayed beside her, his faith in the unseen unwavering, his heart determined to stand by her no matter what. In the quiet of their home, with the flickering light of the fire casting shadows on the walls, Zuri and Kofi's love became a beacon of hope. They had no answers, but they had each other, and together, they clung to the belief that perhaps the spirits, in their own way, might one day show mercy. Despite the curse, despite the words of the healer, Zuri and Kofi never gave up hope. They had no way of knowing what the future would bring, but they knew that as long as they had each other, they would continue to fight for the one thing they desired most, a child to call their own. The news of Zuri's pregnancy spread through the village like wildfire, causing ripples of both joy and trepidation. After years of heartbreak, prayers and quiet sorrow, the miracle of life had finally taken root in Zuri's womb. The village, still haunted by the curse of infertility that had plagued her for so long, had all but given up hope that this day would ever come. Yet here she was, walking with a glow that seemed to come from deep within her soul, carrying a child that defied all logic and expectation. But as the days passed, the villagers couldn't help but whisper. There were too many unanswered questions. Was this a miracle or a curse? The elders, wise in their years but bound by superstition and the weight of old traditions, began to murmur amongst themselves. Some said that Zuri's child was a blessing from the gods, an answer to years of heartache. Others, more fearful and cautious, whispered that this child, born under such mysterious circumstances, was not a gift but a portent of something far darker. Zuri, too, could feel the weight of uncertainty pressing on her heart. Her pregnancy was strange. There was no denying the joy that bloomed in her chest each time she felt the child move, but there were also strange occurrences that unsettled her. Her dreams were filled with images that felt too vivid, too real. She would wake in the dead of night, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding as she tried to make sense of the visions that had plagued her sleep. Spirits danced in the moonlight, gods with faces she didn't recognize spoke in a language she couldn't understand, and the sea, endless and black, rose and fell with an intensity that made her blood run cold. In her dreams she would hear a voice, low and comforting, calling her name, telling her that this child would change everything. The dreams, though unsettling, also seemed to carry a promise, a sense of destiny she couldn't quite grasp. As the months wore on, Zuri grew more and more aware of the whispers. The elders had always spoken of spirits and omens, but this felt different. The way the wind would still when she passed by, the way animals would follow her, there was something in the air, something shifting. It was as though the child inside her was already in tune with forces beyond their world. The village, once so familiar, now felt alien. She began to wonder if the curse had been lifted or if it had simply changed form. The night of her labor arrived with an almost unnatural stillness. The stars above the village twinkled brighter than ever, as if they were watching, waiting. The sky itself seemed to hold its breath. It was a rare celestial event, a moment that had only been spoken of in ancient prophecies, an alignment of the stars that only occurred once in a lifetime. The village elder had spoken of it in hushed tones, recounting the stories of the gods who were said to be born during such events. It was believed that those born under this alignment would carry the blood of both the gods and the earth, beings of unimaginable power. But no one knew what that truly meant. Zuri's labor was long and painful, but when the first cry of her child broke through the stillness of the night, it was as though the world itself exhaled. The sound echoed through the village, reverberating in the hearts of those who heard it. It was a cry that was not just human, it was something more, something primal and pure, carrying the weight of destiny. The villagers, gathered in their homes, felt the shift in the air, the electric charge that seemed to pulse through the very earth beneath their feet. It was as though the world itself was waiting for this moment. When Zuri's child was born, the room was filled with an otherworldly light. Her son, wrapped in the soft blankets, was beautiful beyond words, but there was something strange about him. His skin, though smooth and flawless, bore a mark, an intricate symbol that glowed faintly in the dark. It was unlike anything Zuri had ever seen. The mark was not of this world. It shimmered and pulsed like a living thing, as if the child carried the essence of something ancient, something beyond human understanding. The moment she held him in her arms, a wave of warmth and love washed over Zuri, but at the same time she felt a cold shiver of fear. What had she brought into the world? What had this child come to do? His first gaze, wide and curious, seemed to pierce through her as if he understood her thoughts, her fears. He reached out to her with tiny hands, and for a moment, Zuri was filled with the deepest sense of connection, as though her soul had always known him. But there was something else, something in his eyes that unnerved her. It was as though he saw beyond the walls of their small hut, beyond the limitations of the world they lived in. As the days passed, Zuri's joy in her child's presence began to be tempered by an unease she couldn't shake. Akin, as she had named him, began to grow at an unnatural rate. The child's powers began to show themselves almost immediately. The animals in the village, once cautious of humans, now followed him wherever he went. The birds would fly alongside him, the dogs would sit at his feet, and even the wild creatures of the forest seemed to sense his presence. There was a strange harmony between him and the world around him. The weather too seemed to bend to his will. When Akin cried, the clouds would gather, and when he laughed, the sun would break through the clouds as though the heavens themselves were responding to his emotions. But it wasn't just the animals and the weather. There were moments when Zuri would catch him staring at the wind, his eyes fixed and unblinking, as though he were listening to something no one else could hear. At times, it was as if the very elements were speaking to him. There were even moments when he seemed to communicate with things unseen. Stones would move when he touched them, and water would ripple and swirl as though guided by his tiny hands. The villagers who had once believed in the power of spirits and gods, began to speak in hushed voices, their fears growing as the child's abilities became undeniable. Zuri's joy was mixed with dread. She loved her child with all her heart, but the strange occurrences that followed him, the way he seemed to bend the world around him, filled her with both wonder and fear. Was this a blessing, as the village elders had hoped, or was it the sign of something darker, something she was not prepared to understand? Her love for Akin was unconditional, but with each passing day, the weight of his powers grew heavier on her heart. She was caught between wanting to protect him and fearing what he might become. The child she had longed for, the one who had been promised as a miracle, was more than she had ever expected. And as much as she loved him, Zuri could not deny the nagging feeling that he was not just her son. He was something much greater, something that would change everything. Whether that change would be for good or ill, she could not yet say. But one thing was certain. Akin's arrival had marked the beginning of a new chapter in the village's history, and the echoes of his birth would be felt long after the stars had faded from the sky. As the days passed, Akin's remarkable abilities became more and more apparent. At first, they were small things, strange occurrences that could be explained away as coincidences. But as he grew, the signs of his power became undeniable, and the whispers of the villagers began to swell. It was as though the world itself responded to his presence. One evening, as a storm rolled in, dark clouds gathering and lightning crackling on the horizon, Akin, no more than 3 years old, stood in the middle of the village square. His small hands reached toward the sky, and with a voice that sounded far too deep and knowing for one so young, he called to the storm. The winds, which had been howling with ferocity, suddenly stilled, and the sky above seemed to part, as though acknowledging his command. The storm, which had once threatened to tear the village apart, calmed as if it had never existed. Zuri watched in awe as the village fell silent. The other villagers stared, wide-eyed, as the tempest faded, and the air around them grew warm and still. It was a miracle, or so they thought at first. But as Akin's powers continued to grow, so did the fear that he was something other than human. His abilities were not limited to controlling storms. When Zuri's garden, once barren from years of drought, began to bloom, she realized that it was Akin's touch that brought the plants to life. He could make crops sprout from the earth in an instant, coaxing the very soil to give up its bounty. And it wasn't just the plants that responded to him. Animals too seemed to be drawn to him. They would follow him wherever he went, their eyes filled with an almost unnatural trust. The village's livestock, once hesitant to approach humans, would nuzzle Akin's small hands, as though they could feel the power he carried within. The most unsettling part of Akin's growing abilities, however, was the way he began to speak. As he matured, his voice began to take on an unusual quality. When he spoke to the elders, it was as though he could communicate with them in a way no one else could. His words, though simple, carried a weight that left even the wisest elders speechless. They would listen to him intently, as though his words held the answers to questions they had long since given up asking. But when Zuri would ask him about what he had said, he would often give her an enigmatic response, as though he himself did not fully understand the depth of his words. The elders who had once held the wisdom of the ages, now turned to Akin for guidance. They began to believe that he was not just a child of the village, but a child of something greater, a being with knowledge beyond their understanding. Zuri's dreams too began to change. At first, they were filled with the same strange images and visions that had plagued her during her pregnancy: spirits, gods, and the ever-present sea. But now the dreams became clearer, more direct. The spirits of her ancestors began to speak to her, their voices soft but insistent, calling to her in the dead of night. They warned her that Akin's powers were both a gift and a burden, that he was the key to something much larger than their village, a soul with a purpose that went beyond anything they could comprehend. The ancestors spoke of an ancient prophecy, one that had been buried in the sands of time, forgotten by most but remembered by the spirits who watched over them. Akin was not just a child born of miraculous circumstances. He was the fulfillment of an ancient debt, a soul destined to change the course of their people's future. But with that destiny came a heavy price, a price that Zuri was not yet ready to face. As Akin's powers continued to grow, the village became divided. Some saw him as a divine gift, a blessing from the gods who had finally answered the village's prayers. They spoke of his powers in reverence, believing that he was the answer to all of their problems, that with his abilities they could finally overcome the struggles they had faced for generations. They believed that Akin was a sign of favor, a herald of a new era of prosperity and peace. But others saw him differently. They were afraid. The elders who had once been so certain of their understanding of the world now found themselves questioning everything they had believed. Akin's abilities, though miraculous, were unnatural in their eyes. They whispered of a long-forgotten prophecy, one that spoke of a child born with powers that could either save or destroy. The child, they feared, was not just a gift, but a harbinger of destruction. His power, if unchecked, could lead to the unraveling of everything they had built. The thought that this child might be the one to bring about the end of their village was a fear they could not ignore. Tensions in the village grew as the fear of Akin's power spread. Some villagers began to demand that Zuri keep her son's abilities hidden, that she stop letting him use his powers in public. They feared that if the wrong people saw what he could do, they would seek to take him away, to control him or destroy him. The elders too began to approach Zuri with their concerns. They urged her to keep Akin's powers in check, to limit what he could do. They feared that if Akin's powers grew too strong, there would be no way to control him. Zuri, caught between her love for her son and her fear of the unknown, struggled with the weight of the situation. She knew that Akin was not like other children. He was something more, something powerful, but she also knew that his gifts were not something to be feared. He was her son, her miracle, and she could not let fear dictate his future. But as the tension in the village continued to rise, Zuri began to question whether her love for Akin was enough to protect him from the forces that sought to control him. She could feel the pull of the ancient prophecy, the weight of the burden that had been placed upon her son's shoulders, and she wondered if she could protect him from the very future he was destined to shape. As Akin's powers grew, so did the pressure on Zuri. The elders continued to demand that she hide him away, that she suppress his gifts for the safety of the village. But Zuri knew that she could not hide Akin forever. His power was part of who he was, part of his very essence. And though she feared what the future might hold, she also knew that she could not hold him back. The future had already begun, and Akin was the key to everything that was yet to come. The village was at a crossroads, torn between the fear of the unknown and the hope that Akin's powers could lead them to a new future. Zuri, with her heart heavy and her mind clouded with doubt, stood at the center of it all, knowing that the choices she made now would determine the course of their lives for generations to come. Zuri's sleep had become restless, haunted by dreams that felt too real, too vivid. The visions had grown stronger in the weeks following Akin's birth, as if the universe itself was trying to tell her something she could no longer ignore. The dreams were no longer vague glimpses of spirits and gods. They had become clearer, more direct. One night, as the wind howled through the trees and the moonlight cast an eerie glow over the village, Zuri found herself once again in the realm of her ancestors. But this time, the spirits did not wait for her to stumble upon the truth. They came to her. The earth beneath her feet felt soft, as though it were breathing, alive with the weight of secrets buried deep within it. The spirits of her ancestors were there, their faces both familiar and distant. Their presence filled the air, as though the very air itself was charged with their energy. They spoke in unison, their voices like a distant echo, haunting yet comforting. Zuri, they called to her, their voices resonating deep within her soul. You have been chosen, but your bloodline carries a debt. A debt that must be paid, for your ancestors wronged a powerful spirit long ago. Zuri's heart raced as the spirits began to unravel the story of her family's past, a tale that had been buried in the dust of time. Her ancestors, once powerful and revered, had broken a sacred pact with a mighty spirit of the earth. This spirit, ancient and wise, had granted them favor, blessings of fertility, prosperity, and peace. But greed and pride had clouded their judgment, and they had betrayed the spirit's trust. In their arrogance, they had broken the pact, taking what had been given without offering the balance the spirit demanded. The spirit's wrath had been swift and unforgiving. The spirits of her ancestors spoke of the curse that followed. Her bloodline, marked by this betrayal, would suffer the loss of what they valued most, children. No descendant of that bloodline would bear children until the debt was repaid. For generations, her family had borne the weight of that curse, and Zuri, though she knew nothing of the debt when she was born, was now caught in the web of that ancient sin. You are the last, the spirits whispered, their voices growing heavier. The last of your bloodline to carry the weight of the curse. The debt must be repaid, and your son is the one who will do it. Zuri's mind reeled. Akin. Her son. The child she had prayed for. But now, in the stillness of the night, it was clear. He was not just a child born of her longing. Akin was something more. His existence was no accident. He was the key to ending the curse, to restoring balance, but his powers were not his own. They were tied to the earth, the sky, the spirits of the land. He was a vessel, a force that could either heal the world or destroy it. The revelation hit Zuri like a thunderclap. Akin was not merely her child, he was a being of unimaginable power, a child born with the essence of a god. His powers, though wondrous, were not a gift but a responsibility. The spirits had granted him the strength to fulfill his purpose, to restore the balance her family had broken, but that power came with a heavy cost. The curse would only be lifted when Akin fulfilled his destiny, when the debt of his ancestors was paid. And yet, there was a terrible truth buried within the prophecy. The price for his gifts would require a sacrifice. A life for a life. The spirits, seeing the turmoil in Zuri's heart, spoke again, their voices softening. You must choose, Zuri. Your son's destiny is entwined with the fate of this land. His gifts are both a blessing and a burden. He will bring change to this village, but that change may come at a terrible cost. You must decide whether to help him fulfill his purpose or to protect him from the very destiny he was born to fulfill. Zuri's heart broke as the weight of the decision settled upon her. The spirits spoke of balance, of how the land, the village, and the people must give something in return for Akin's gifts. If they were to keep the blessings he had brought, they would need to make a sacrifice. It could be the land itself, the village, or even the people. The curse would only be lifted when the balance of nature was restored, but the cost could be unimaginable. Zuri knew what it meant. Akin's power, which had been a source of wonder and fear, was the key to restoring the balance her family had broken. But it was not a simple path. The land might demand a life in exchange for Akin's gifts. The village might be forced to offer up its most valuable resource, its people. She could not protect him from this burden. No matter how fiercely she loved him, no matter how deeply she wished for a different future, Akin was not a child who could live a simple life. He was the living embodiment of an ancient prophecy, a soul that had been born to restore balance, but the price of that balance was steep. Torn between her love for her son and the responsibility of her bloodline, Zuri struggled to find a way out. The villagers, who had once seen Akin as a gift, would soon come to realize that his powers were not without consequence. The fear that had taken root in their hearts would only grow, and the village was on the brink of conflict. The elders too would soon see the reality of Akin's power, and many of them would demand that Zuri hide her son, suppress his abilities to prevent the village from tearing itself apart. Zuri knew that the decision she made now would shape the future of the village and Akin's legacy. If she embraced his powers, if she allowed him to fulfill his destiny, it would mean sacrifice, a sacrifice that would affect everyone. But if she tried to protect him from the weight of his purpose, if she tried to shield him from the world that awaited him, she would be condemning the village to suffer under the curse of her ancestors forever. The village was teetering on the edge of war, divided by fear, uncertainty, and the growing realization that Akin's powers could change everything. Zuri's love for her son was fierce and unyielding, but the future she had dreamed of for him was slipping further and further away. Akin was no ordinary child. He was a soul unlike any other, and his destiny was greater than her love, greater than anything she had ever hoped for. The choice Zuri faced was not just about her son's future. It was about the fate of an entire village, the fulfillment of an ancient debt, and the cost of balancing the forces of the natural world. As the dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, Zuri stood at the edge of a precipice. She had been given a choice, one that would determine the course of everything to come. The weight of her decision pressed heavily upon her heart. What would she choose? To embrace the prophecy, to let Akin become the key to restoring balance? Or to protect him, to shield him from the heavy burden of his gifts, even if it meant condemning her bloodline and the village to a future marked by the curse of the past? The spirits waited, their voices echoing in the silence of her mind. The choice was hers. And in that moment, Zuri realized that whatever path she chose, the future would never be the same. As the days passed, Zuri's heart grew heavier. The weight of the decision before her pressed on her, gnawing at her soul. The villagers were restless, caught between hope and fear, between reverence and dread. Akin, once a child of pure potential, now seemed to carry the very weight of the village's future on his small shoulders. His abilities had begun to show restraint, something Zuri had never expected. He would no longer call upon the storms for his own amusement, nor would he wield his power without purpose. Instead, Akin had come to understand that his gifts, though extraordinary, were not meant to be used carelessly. He had begun to use them to heal the village, to restore the balance that had been shattered. When a sickness struck the village, Akin's gentle touch was all it took to ease the suffering. Where once the crops had failed, now they thrived, bursting forth from the earth as if answering to his very will. He calmed the storms that had once threatened to tear apart the village, turning the rains into gentle showers that nourished the land. The villagers, once so divided, began to see him as the miracle they had long awaited. But Zuri could not ignore the growing weight of his destiny. With every act of kindness, every display of his power, the burden of his purpose grew heavier, and the price of his gift seemed more imminent. As Akin's powers grew, so did the fear among the villagers. There were those who saw his abilities as a sign of divine favor, a child sent from the gods to heal the land. They spoke of him with awe, praising his power and believing that he was the key to their salvation. But there were others, led by the elder who had once cursed Zuri, who saw Akin's powers as unnatural, a sign that the balance of nature had been disturbed. To them, Akin was a harbinger of destruction, a force that could never be controlled. His abilities, they believed, were too dangerous, too unpredictable, and must be suppressed. The village, once united, now found itself divided. Tensions rose and whispers grew louder with each passing day. Those who feared Akin's power demanded that he be cast out, that his abilities be sealed away for the safety of the people. Zuri, caught between the love she had for her son and the growing pressure from the village, found herself standing at the center of a storm. The village was on the brink of civil war, torn between those who saw Akin as a blessing and those who saw him as a curse. Zuri could feel the shifting tides of power, the fragile balance between hope and fear. The moment of decision was drawing near. She and Akin could no longer stand at the center of it all. The village would force a choice. It was Akin who spoke first. After days of silent contemplation, he approached Zuri, his eyes glowing with an intensity that both frightened and reassured her. "Mother," he said, his voice calm and steady, "I see what you are struggling with. I see the fear in the village and I understand their concerns. But I also know that I am not just a child. I am something more." He paused, his small hands trembling slightly as he spoke. "I am the bridge between this world and the world of the spirits. My powers are not mine alone. They are a gift, but they come with a price. I must fulfill my purpose." Zuri's heart ached as she listened to him. Her son, the child she had longed for, had grown into someone wiser, stronger than she had ever expected. But she knew what he was asking. Akin, with the purity of a child and the wisdom of the ancients, had come to understand what she had feared all along. His purpose was not to live as a ruler or a god, but to be the one who restored the balance that had been broken. And in doing so he would be forced to make the ultimate sacrifice. In a climactic moment, as the villagers gathered in the center of the village, Akin stood before them, his eyes filled with resolve. "I know the cost of my existence," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his destiny. "But I will not bring ruin to this village. I will not destroy what my mother and father have worked for. If my powers are the cause of this strife, then I will give them up." The elders, standing at the front of the gathered crowd, watched with a mix of awe and fear. "Akin," the elder who had once cursed Zuri said, his voice trembling with both reverence and suspicion, "you do not know what you ask. Your powers are not just yours. They are the legacy of our ancestors, the price we must pay for their sin. We cannot allow you to give up what is yours by right." But Akin, with the wisdom of someone far beyond his years, simply shook his head. "It is not my right to hold this power if it brings harm to the people I love. I offer it up to restore the balance. If it is my life that must be the price for peace, then I will accept it." Zuri, her heart breaking as she listened to her son's words, stepped forward. "Akin," she whispered, her voice full of both love and sorrow, "do not give up who you are. You are my son and you have the right to live." But Akin, with the purity of his heart and the wisdom of the spirits, made his choice. He raised his hands and the village fell silent as the air seemed to shift. "I offer my powers," he said, his voice a whisper, "to restore the balance. I give them freely for the peace of this village." The spirits who had watched over him since his birth responded. The winds shifted, and the air hummed with energy as the spirits spoke to him. "You have chosen wisely, Akin," they said, their voices echoing in his mind. "Your sacrifice will bring peace, but it will not be without its cost. We will honor your choice." And then, in a moment that felt both eternal and fleeting, Akin's powers were sealed. The glowing mark on his skin faded, and the energy that had once pulsed through him seemed to dissipate into the very earth. The village, once filled with tension and fear, began to breathe again. The storm that had threatened to tear it apart had passed, and in its wake there was peace. But this peace came at a price. Akin's powers were dormant, sealed within him, but the village, now healed, learned the hard lesson that the greatest power often comes not from the ability to wield force, but from the ability to make the hardest choices. Zuri and Akin, standing side by side, understood that their journey was far from over. They had chosen redemption, and in doing so they had restored the balance. The village, now aware of the consequences of their actions, learned to embrace both the spiritual and physical aspects of life. They understood that power, when misused, can bring ruin, but when tempered with wisdom and sacrifice, it can restore what was broken. Zuri, looking at her son, knew that the future would never be the same. Akin had given up his powers, but in doing so, he had fulfilled his destiny, not by wielding power but by giving it up for the good of the village. The balance had been restored, and with it, a new chapter began. The village would thrive, but it would never forget the lessons learned from the child who had been born to change their world. As Zuri stood at the edge of the village, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. Her heart was full, yet heavy with the knowledge that the path she had walked was fraught with both blessings and burdens. The curse that had once defined her life, that had stolen her joy and denied her the one thing she desired most, had become the very thing that set her free. Akin, her son, had been born under the most extraordinary of circumstances, a child of both the earth and the gods, a vessel of immense power. His arrival, which had been a miracle in the eyes of the village, had also carried with it the weight of an ancient debt, one that had threatened to destroy everything she held dear. But Akin had borne that weight with grace, understanding that his powers were not his alone. They were tied to something much larger than his own life. The prophecy, the curse, the burden of his gifts, these were not just challenges to overcome. They were lessons, reminders of the fragile balance that exists between the physical world and the spiritual realm. In the end, Akin had made the hardest choice of all, to give up his powers, to sacrifice the very essence of who he was, for the good of the village. It was an act of true humility, an offering that restored balance to a world teetering on the edge of destruction. Zuri had always known that the greatest power came not from domination, but from sacrifice. She had watched her son choose redemption over ruin, and in doing so, he had rewritten the fate of their village. But as she stood in the quiet of the evening, with the stars above her and the whispers of the spirits in the wind, she understood the true cost of what they had done. Akin had given up his divine gifts, but the peace they had brought to the village would last only as long as the villagers themselves remained vigilant. The curse had been lifted, but it had come with the understanding that power, whether spiritual or earthly, must always be held with great care. The village, once divided by fear and uncertainty, had begun to rebuild. The people, now free from the curse, learned to live in harmony with the forces of nature and the spirits who had watched over them. No longer was Akin seen as a harbinger of destruction, but as a symbol of hope, a reminder that the greatest changes often come from the most unlikely places. The village thrived, but it was forever changed. The spirits, once vengeful, had found peace, and the land, once scarred by greed and fear, had been restored. Zuri, standing alongside Akin, knew that their journey was not over. The legacy of the firstborn, of a child born of gods, of power, of sacrifice, would live on. But the true lesson lay in the balance they had found. The village and the world beyond it would always face challenges. The forces of nature, the spirits, and the earth would continue to shape their lives. But as long as they remembered the lessons of the past, the sacrifices that had been made, they would walk the path of wisdom, understanding that power must be tempered with responsibility, and that redemption is a journey that requires both courage and humility. And so, as the stars twinkled above and the wind whispered through the trees, Zuri knew that Akin's legacy and her own would continue to echo through the ages. The village, now at peace, would forever remember the child born to restore balance, and the sacrifices that had been made to ensure that the world would never forget the price of true power.